I don't think that fear gets the most out of people. While it's a very, very strong motivator, you're never going to get the same level of performance out of somebody who's driven by love than somebody who's driven by fear.
Hello and welcome to Love as a Business Strategy, a podcast that brings humanity to the workplace. We're here to talk about business, but we want to tackle topics that most business leaders shy away from. And we believe that humanity and love should be at the center of every successful business. I'm your host, Jeff Ma, and as always, I'm here to have conversations and hear stories with real people about real business, real life. My guest today is Dr. Laura Gallaher, and Laura is an organizational psychologist, professional speaker, and a true inspiration for driven individuals looking to achieve more while making life easier. She's accomplished some incredible things in her career, including working with NASA to transform their culture following the Columbia incident, collaborating with Disney to revolutionize performance management for their leaders, and inspiring global teams at Yahoo to seek transformation from the inside out. Dr. Laura is also a USA Today and Wall Street Journal best-selling author, and her insights on radical self-acceptance have been featured in Forbes, Psychology Today, HuffPost, and TEDx. So it's a wonderful honor to have you on the show here today. Laura, how are you doing?
Jeff, I am so excited for this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. I find that these 30-minute episodes require me to jump right in.
Yeah, let's do it.
So I have to ask my first question, which is personal, but what is your passion and where does it come from? Two-parter.
My passion is around inspiring introspection.
Ooh.
Yeah. I just think that we have such a tendency as human beings to walk through the world in such an unconscious way. And some of that's necessary. We need our subconscious to help us make a lot of decisions. But then often we will start to blame the world and blame other people for our own bad feelings instead of actually looking inward. And I think that if more people did that, we could live in a very, very different world.
I love that answer. Can you define introspection by just like, as opposed to, I feel like it's a word that people may not even have the self-awareness to understand that they're not being introspective, if that makes sense. So
totally.
So how would you define it? Maybe differentiate it from like reflection or just like passive thoughts about yourself. What does true introspection look like to you?
To me, true introspection is about turning the microscope inward and really reflecting on a deeper level. What is motivating me to behave in the way that I do? And specifically, where I think the introspection gets really powerful is when we start to look at fears. We have a workshop that we do with all of our clients. And when we ask everybody to do their introductions, we do some of the typical stuff. Tell us your name, your role in the organization. And we ask them, any fears? Any fears you have? And it's really intriguing for me as a psychologist to listen to the answers that people have, because it ranges from anything to like, I'm not really afraid of anything. I don't have any fears. So total denial of the impact of fear on their lives, to I actually had a participant in December in a workshop say, just, all the simple terrors of simply waking up every day. And I was like, okay, this person is heavily aware of their own fears. But the truth is that fear drives absolutely all of us in ways we don't understand. So introspection to me is not just, I know my strengths and my weaknesses, and so I'm self-aware, but do I really understand my triggers? Like, what are some of those thorns that are being, pushed up against? And how am I actually contributing to every situation in my life, even the ones that I claim to be unhappy about? That kind of deep introspection.
I love that. 100% aligned to what you're saying here. Even when we were writing the book, Love as a Business Strategy, we were constantly referring jokingly to its kind of alternate universe, kind of bizarro world book, Love as a Fear Strategy, because the exact inverse of everything, like, and we would still, lovingly kind of refer to other businesses who, if you're not practicing love as a business strategy, if you're not applying that, then you're really letting fear drive
Yes.
everything else, which it
100%.
which it does naturally, right? Like we don't
Mhm.
want to fear of getting in trouble with the boss, fear of not
Yeah,
hitting the quota, fear of not living up to our own standards. All these things
absolutely.
are our motivators.
Yeah,
So
and fear is a strong one. It's a really, really strong motivator, but it's motivating us from a survival place, and the vast majority of the time, thank goodness, we don't actually need to be in survival mode. We're actually very much safe physically most of the time, and our brain is just not operating in that spot yet. It just has all these interpersonal fears and all these intrapersonal fears, and they hang out in our subconscious, and we blame other people for it instead of looking inward.
sure. Do you think what's your kind of take on fear as an element of like, I think we all naturally feel fear just, in our own minds and our own beliefs. But then there's also fear like as a somewhat more intentional tool, maybe through leadership, through corporate structure, through rules and, all these things. Sorry, maybe unintentional as well, right?
Mhm.
Um, can you talk a little bit about that element in the workplace specifically? Because I do struggle with kind of balancing this concept of fear and how much of it like is the leader what is the leader's job when it comes to fear, and is it in terms of reducing it or alleviating it or using it, like what is the element of fear kind of in a
Yeah.
leader's role?
So I don't wanna be rigid or dogmatic. So I wanna say this intentionally. I will say I am rarely an advocate of intentionally using fear. I don't think that fear gets the most out of people. While it's a very, very strong motivator, you're never gonna get the same level of performance out of somebody who's driven by love, as you know, than somebody who's driven by fear. But so much fear, like you pointed out already, it's inherent. Evolutionarily speaking, it was so useful for us to be afraid. I joke about back in the day, if I'm walking with a friend and that friend says, "Oh, there's a saber-toothed tiger over there. Do you want to go pet it and say hello?" I might go, "You know what? I'm going to hide behind this rock. You go say hi. Let me know how that goes." Right. And so, in that kind of instance, being fearful and focusing on my physical safety allowed me to survive. And so, my descendants also grew up with that fear and they learned that that fear kept them safe. So conceptually, I totally get why we exist with so much fear. But society and business has evolved much faster than our brains have evolved. And so we've got this really strong fear mechanism within us that's still focused on just trying to survive. Jeff, have you seen Office Space?
Of course.
Of course. Okay. Thank goodness. I was going to say, you've got to watch it if you haven't. He's got such a great line, Peter, the main character, our protagonist, when he's talking to the Bobs, the consultants, and he talks about the fear of being, or, fear of getting in trouble or fired or whatever. And he said, the problem with that strategy is that it gets people to work just hard enough to not get fired. And it's so true.
Yeah.
And not only is it not going to be as motivating, that like, oh, I just don't want to get fired. I'll just be above the bar. Obviously, you're going to motivate somebody a lot more if you can get them to like believe in a vision, feel like they're contributing to something meaningful, right? Actually see all the gains and moving with love. But when you're using fear, it has a lot of unintended consequences as well that just drop the vibe of everybody in the office and creates a lot of distraction and actually hurts productivity. And then even if you've got people who are like pumping stuff out because you're so afraid, it is a short-term strategy. They are going to burn out real fast and your turnover is going to skyrocket.
I find that working with leaders, there's a huge often lack of self-awareness of the fear that they create.
Mhm.
And sometimes I would even argue they're not technically doing anything that creates the fear. It's almost as they're just not addressing it head on.
Yeah,
It exists whether it's them or somebody else or these
it's
people.
co-created.
Yeah,
It's totally co-created. Absolutely. And I agree with you, Jeff. I am one of those leaders and I have been one of those leaders that doesn't recognize some of the ways that I am contributing to people on my team feeling fear. As you know, I worked with NASA following the Columbia accident, and we were primarily focused on teaching the leaders how to create psychological safety. Because without getting super deep into the weeds of it, psychological safety was not strong enough for the engineers to continue speaking up, even in a life and death situation. And of course, self-deception played a huge role, right? It's more complicated than what I'm saying right now. But there I was, this PhD in psychology, coaching these leaders on psychological safety. And then I moved into a leadership position. And I completed one of those 360 assessments, which I have a lot of opinions about now. And I got feedback from, I mean, my feedback was mostly positive, right? My internal customers were really happy with me. My leaders were happy with me. My peers were happy with me. But I remember turning to this page, and we were like on a lunch break in this leadership training. And I turned to this page that's talking about these negative leadership influence tactics. And there were like two people on my team who indicated that they felt that I would sometimes bully them intellectually. Oh, like gut punch, total gut punch. I was horrified. I don't know what my face looked like, but I was talking to my coach in the program later that afternoon, and she was like, I saw your face when you're looking at the report. It was hilarious. Like, I'm glad you could laugh at my pain and my horror, but I was so horrified. At no point in time, Jeff, did I ever say, like, I'm just going to bully them intellectually until they agree with me, right? There was no intention of that. But being passionate, having strong opinions, wanting to maybe prove myself, because I was still like mid-20s at this point, I had all kinds of defense mechanisms that were popping up for me that led me to contribute to fear on my team. And I was like, oh my gosh, I am supposed to be coaching other people on creating psychological safety. And I myself am struggling to do that with at least a couple of people on my team. So it's not enough to know. You can't just know about these topics. That's why I say, my passion is to inspire introspection. Have to be able to like go deeper and understand, how are some of my own fears contributing to some of these behaviors that are not at all effective.
My story just mirrors yours so much. I mean,
Really?
I didn't take a 360. I have thoughts of that as well. But
Mhm.
for me, there's a term we use called intellectual arrogance, and
Mm.
it's born out of partially like a mindset, uh, partially out of just passive behavior elements of how you. And it's just so present in a lot of leaders that I've met, but in myself particularly. Just this idea that you're not intentionally bullying people
Mhm.
around like you just mentioned, but just kind of like being really strong minded and really feeling like you have the right ideas,
Yeah.
and kind of that fixed mindset and unwilling to just unlearn
Yeah,
is
unlearn, see other
is
perspectives. Am I even
yes,
1% wrong? Right?
exactly. And
Yeah,
yeah, that was a journey I'm still on, to be
same.
honest. So
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, running a business, I can get I take things very personally, I think, by my nature, and so learning to be aware of my emotions and not overly attach or identify with those emotions in a moment is super important for me to maintain an awareness of, does my intention match my impact right now?
mm,
And some of that's going to be on me, and some of it's always going to be on the other person that I'm talking to. Like, it's always co-created. Like, was I a bully as a label? I wouldn't think so. Were there behaviors that somebody might label as bullying? You could. And I definitely thought it was useful feedback, and I was able to learn from it and grow from it. And the people who indicated that as feedback, some of that is what they bring in to the conversation. It's their
sure.
own fears,
Yeah.
right? It's maybe they didn't feel equipped to engage in healthy conflict or debate me on a particular topic because they felt like I knew more and I was leveraging some of my knowledge in that conversation. They didn't, oh, I feel bullied intellectually, which, by the way, it's not like they wrote that in. It was just like one of the options of like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes she does that. And so every situation is co-created. I assume you're similar, Jeff. We put a lot of extra responsibility on the leaders because they impact everything disproportionately.
Yes, 100%. And
Yeah.
I love this term you keep using of co-creating,
Mhm.
because it implies collaboration and relationship
Yeah.
to some extent. And that's such a powerful way to frame it because
Mhm.
I agree with you. And I do put a lot, like, it starts with leaders. Leaders set the tone, leaders have an outsized influence. But at the same time, it is a relationship, whether intentionally or unintentionally built. So that
Yeah,
idea of
absolutely.
co-creating these relationships is really powerful to me. I think that's how I'm going to frame it from now on, to be
I
honest.
love it.
Stealing it. It's mine now.
Good. Please use it. I want more people to understand it. It's such an important mindset to have. Like when something goes wrong, which things go wrong, right? Murphy's Law, things are going to go wrong. When teams adopt a mindset of everyone is 100% responsible and no one is to blame, that is the essence of recognizing co creation. So it doesn't become a game of like, well, it's like 20% me, but 80% you. Right? Like we don't want to play that game because then defenses go up again. And now here we are in this space where information stops flowing, communication shuts down, and we try to solve the problem, but we don't even really understand what happened because people are too busy trying to cover their own butts rather than actually like explore what was contributing to this.
So let me dig in there a little bit. I I love that, but I find that to be one of the hardest things to practice, right? To actually, if someone comes to me and says, "Hey, you were wrong," or "You did something wrong," my knee-jerk reaction is defensiveness because of fear. I don't want to
Mhm.
be called out. I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to look bad. I don't want to be
Yep.
embarrassed. And so, what is your kind of approach or advice on how to shift that into something that's more, again, like you said, co-created or something more healthy?
Yeah. Well, I can speak to that, my perception of it from both the giver side and the receiver side. I would probably not advocate that somebody go up and say, like, you're wrong as a starting point in a conversation, or really at any point. Instead of you're wrong, a statement of, okay, I see that differently. I'd like to explore that together. Right. You're wrong is a little harsh and is often going to trigger defensiveness from somebody, even if they're higher on self acceptance. Um, so from the giving side, if I want to start the conversation and in my mind, I'm kind of thinking like, oh, this person screwed this up, right? Or they're wrong or they made a mistake. If I can embrace the idea of co-creation, then what I want to do with my introspection is ask through my action or my inaction, right? Something I said or didn't say, something that I did or didn't do, any contribution, action or inaction. How did I prevent a solution to the problem? What was my contribution? There's always something, like literally always something. If you get blocked in trying to answer that question, then that tells me that self judgment is super high, self acceptance is super low, and you're unwilling to see that you have contributed to what's happening. And that's a very disempowered place to be. Because if I cannot find anything that I did or didn't do to contribute to exactly what happened as the outcome, then I can't do anything different at all to make it different in the future. I am completely useless in that moment. Most people don't want to feel that way. Most of us want to feel like we're empowered. We want to feel like we know what to do in order to make something better in the future. So you want leaders to be able to look in and say, what was my part? Even one thing. Now, when I start a conversation with somebody, that's what I lead with. Hey, I noticed that we missed the deadline here on project A. And I was thinking about it, and there's probably a couple things that I could have done to prevent this happening. I think that our check-ins probably weren't frequent enough, and I may have dropped the ball on that. Might have been more useful if we were talking every week instead of on a monthly cadence. And I also wonder if maybe the expectations that we set out in the beginning were a little bit less clear than I thought. What's your take? What do you think's contributed to us missing this deadline? I'm just making stuff up. But if I start the conversation that way, when I lead with self accountability, I'm a lot more likely to get self accountability from the other person in return.
Yeah.
Because that self accountability, that's vulnerable.
Yeah.
And that vulnerability is courageous and courage is contagious. So it really changes the whole nature of the conversation when I can start with self accountability.
Love that. Now, the other person's perspective.
Okay, so wait, what was I just talking about then? I was talking, giving.
That was the giver. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm on the receiving end and someone comes up to me and they just say like, you're wrong, Laura.
Or
And I
they come
noticed,
to you. Maybe they took the middle ground. I was being provocative with my example.
uh-huh.
Maybe it's someone, it's somebody that's, with good
Mhm.
intent, and
Sure,
someone
good intent.
not being abrasive. They're just saying, hey, like, maybe they didn't go all the way to where you said and then started with vulnerability. Maybe they weren't,
Mhm.
starting with their own role in it, but I don't think they're being, abrasive. I think they're just pointing something out, but it's my natural reaction to
Mhm.
be like, oh crap, I'm being called out.
Yeah, to want to defend for sure. Well, so what you're talking about, that defensiveness comes up. That is like the work that I think underlies most of what we do with our clients. And it's literally a journey that I'm still on. And for your listeners who aren't watching, I'm pointing to this tattoo I have in my wrist that says journey because it's a constant journey. Our defense mechanisms exist for a reason. The way that I talk about defenses, it's never actually my interest to be defensive. I'm always going to be more effective when my defenses are down and I'm in a collaborative space, collaborative headspace. But my defenses have an origin story. So there's like a short-term way that we can look at how can I not respond defensively? And then there's a long-term way to say, how can I reduce my defensiveness overall? Short term, like in the moment when it's happening, I actually would recommend that you acknowledge it and notice. So give yourself a moment, pause, take a breath, and say, oof, I notice that I'm having a bit of a reaction to that. And it's just because I hate the idea of having screwed something up. So I do want to understand your perspective. And I just noticed that it's feeling a little rough at the moment. Something, whatever. Like, I don't want to give people a script, but actually acknowledge it, because if you try to power through and pretend that you're not feeling stuff, it's going to ooze out of you in ways that you're probably not even aware of. And then they're going to make up a story in their head about what's going on for you with all these like nonverbals that they're picking up, and it just becomes extremely muddy.
Mm.
So even if it feels strange, pausing long enough to acknowledge, oh, I'm feeling something, can help to change the tone of the conversation, because they'll recognize now, like, okay, you're feeling something. It's also vulnerable. People kind of attend to that. They attune to that. And then I love the 1% rule. Like, my mind loves to jump to why I'm not wrong or why I'm right or why it's somebody else's fault. It's that ego that wants to defend itself. But if I can, instead of thinking I'm 100% right, lean into, is there even 1% truth in what this person is saying?
Mm.
It's really hard for me to say no to that. I'm pretty much always going to be able to find at least 1% truth. And when I keep the door open a crack, even 1%, then I start to see actually more and more and more how much truth there is to what they're saying. And it doesn't mean that it's all my fault. It just means that I'm able to step into my own self-accountability. Right? So 1% rule and giving yourself a pause, I think, are really important to change that like initial defensive reaction. Long term, the antidote is self-acceptance. And I would say radical self-acceptance, which is my favorite thing to talk about.
Well, let's talk about it.
Yeah, like being so okay with who you are right now, with all of your flaws and all of your imperfections. That's all it is. Radical self-acceptance is very simple in concept, but most of us do not practice a lot of self-acceptance. Most of us are embodied in self-judgment, especially the high achieving people and the leaders that I work with. They have a tendency to be really focused on how they can grow and improve themselves, but it doesn't matter how much they improve, they still struggle to actually accept themselves. They have a raging inner critic who can constantly point out things that they're doing wrong. They tell themselves, oh, I'm harder on myself than anybody else. And they always focus on the gap between where they are and where they want to be as evidence that they're not good enough. Do you know anybody like that?
Yeah, I sure do.
Yeah. And so for a lot of people that I work with, this idea of self-acceptance is really new and kind of scary. because people get attached to that inner critic. They think that they need that inner critic.
Yeah.
They think the inner critic and judging themselves, they think that's why they get better, which is coming back to that idea of fear being the driver instead of love. And so I'm usually working with leaders first and foremost to help them recognize that just because you practice self-acceptance doesn't mean you're going to stop improving yourself. Like, these are not opposites. The opposite of self-acceptance isn't self-improvement. The opposite of self-acceptance is self-judgment. So you can focus on self-improvement from a self-judging place, or you can focus on self-improvement from a self-accepting place.
Yeah, as you're talking about self-judgment and defining it, for me personally, definitely resonating. That person I knew was me. Yeah. Um,
Yep.
but
A version of me as well.
in a way, like self-judgment broadly feels like safe and warm to me in a weird way.
Oh, yeah.
It's like as long as I'm kind of critical of myself, as long as I'm like holding myself to this higher standard that I can't achieve, it feels like the zone I need to be in. It feels like me, you know?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it feels like stepping outside of that is like, who is that even? Like, I don't even,
Absolutely.
feels
Yeah.
really
It challenges
unknown.
your identity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Big time. And that's what I find so often when I'm working with people. And so the first hurdle that I usually face is even getting high achieving people to recognize that self-acceptance is worth pursuing, that it is a useful practice, and that it's not going to simply lead somebody to become complacent. What you're talking about, Jeff, you're hitting on like the deepest work, which is identity,
Mm-hmm.
right? So who am I if I don't have my inner critic?
Mm-hmm.
Who am I if I am not really hard on myself? And I think it is worth asking that question and specifically looking toward, if fear isn't my driver, because fear, self-judgment is rooted in fear.
Mm-hmm.
If fear is not my driver to improve, is there anything else that drives me to improve?
Is there even 1% of anything else that's driving me to improve?
Yes. What's true for you, Jeff?
Oh man. I feel like when it comes to like work and monetary achievements, it's like all fear, but I'm able to step in different places when I think of like who I want to be as a father or who I want to
Yeah.
be as a friend or a human. Those types of things soften those edges for me personally.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm less thinking in terms of what I'm not, but thinking of
Yeah.
where I want to go, not because I'm lacking, but because I want to do better.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. You're
so
inspired to be the kind of father who.
exactly.
And I'm looking at your book behind you there on the shelf. And I would argue that throughout your book, you have actually captured the point that I'm making right now. I think maybe you're applying it now to yourself in maybe a new way, but love as a business strategy applies so much to self-concept. Even when you're talking about work, even if you're talking about finances, even if you're talking about the impact you want to have on the world. Yes, there's fear. There's fear of not being enough, fear of not having enough, fear of feeling like you're failing, fear of judgment from other people, all of that. And so those things can be motivators. If you let go of all of that, people are thinking nothing will drive me forward. But I would argue there's this entire cloud over here that's grounded in love. Is there love that inspires me to want to have an impact in this world, that wants people to change their relationship with themselves so they no longer go through this journey constantly feeling like they're not enough? You can have a much bigger impact when you let other things take the lead. I did this talk a few years ago where I was describing fear, like literally fear in the driver's seat of a car. Like, you probably have an idea of if fear's actually driving, like how they drive. You can picture them kind of like white knuckled and kind of spastically like looking around and like checking the blind spots and just like, nervous wreck. The car is probably kind of shaking back and forth because they're just, fear all the time. That is not a pleasant ride. I'm probably going to get carsick if I'm going to let fear drive. And fear doesn't have to leave. Fear has a place. Survival is real. But if we just have fear hang out in the back seat instead, and we let love take the wheel, much smoother ride. And we're still moving. We're still going in the direction that we want to go. And not only are we still going in that direction, we're going to get there faster and we're going to enjoy it more. And so radical self-acceptance works in that same way.
Love it. It's like you knew the episode was reaching its time and you were just like, let me put a bow on this. And there it is.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for all of the insights, all of the amazing kind of perspective you've added today. I think it's going to be a really valuable way for people, listeners and others to really understand better about this concept, because I think this self-acceptance concept is something that I'm sure but as I'm processing it's just hard to really comprehend for the average person.
And that's why we call it radical. I don't want it to be radical, but it is. And, that's part of why we created the free quiz that we created that I invited you to participate in, because so if your listeners are interested and where am I right now in this moment, you can just go to selfacceptancequiz.com. Hopefully the easiest URL to remember, selfacceptancequiz.com. Takes 3 to 5 minutes. And you're going to see right now, based on how you answered the questions, where do you fall in this sort of 2x2 of self-acceptance and self-improvement? Because those things coexist. They're not opposite. And so when you complete the quiz, you'll get a report that shows you where are you right now. And then you'll get several coaching emails as a follow-up to really help you begin to explore this for yourself. Because a lot of people have a similar reaction to you, Jeff, of like, who am I if I'm not being self-critical? But the research is actually pretty clear that when people are focused on self-improvement through the lens of self-acceptance, they do actually grow faster. And so it's a huge counterintuitive move for most of my high-achieving clients to recognize like, oh, I don't need this inner critic to be raging in order to actually grow and improve, but rather I'll grow faster if I can change my whole relationship with it.
I love it. And I hope everyone does take advantage of that. I did take it earlier this morning, actually. So got my results. We'll talk about it later. Self-acceptance quiz, selfacceptancequiz.com. I'll put it in the show notes as well. So hopefully everyone takes advantage of that. And Laura, thank you so much for joining. I think this was great for me personally, but I know it's also going to be valuable for anyone listening. So I really appreciate the time you had today.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
To our listeners, thank you so much for sticking with us. We hope you enjoyed this, and we hope you keep checking us out every other week. We'll be here, and please check out the book, Love is a Business Strategy. Don't forget, and we will talk to you next time. Bye.